Director of the Center for African and African American Studies, and on behalf of the Center and the English Department here at SUNO, I'd like to welcome you to this celebration of the publication of a very important book, Erotique Noire, Black Erotica, published by Doubleday. Just came out less than a month ago, edited by DaCosta, Martin, and Bell. This is the first time black authors have written explicitly about black sexuality in an erotic way. It's been heralded as the first publication of its kind. Among the contributors is Sandra Govan, who's written probably the definitive analytical piece in the book, and she'll give you some details about the content of that. We're also going to have a book signing ceremony, some refreshments at the end. You'll have the opportunity to see the publication up close, and if you have money, purchase it. The book is important also because it features 4 local writers, Lee Ben, Michelle Pichon, Kalamu Yasalam, and yours truly. These 2 or 3 of us will be here to autograph those copies if you do want to purchase. This morning's speaker, as I said before, is Dr. Sandra Govan, who's an associate professor of English at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte, where she teaches black literature and the literature of popular culture. She's also an avid film buff and a poet in her own right. And one of her poems, at least one of them, is also featured in this book. Dr. Sandra Govan.
Good morning, and thank you very much for coming out. I'm glad to have been invited to participate in this presentation. I guess I ought to get started, but before I do, I want to say that all those students who have papers due, I understand that all of your teachers still want your papers. Even though you're here, they still want your papers, and as an English teacher, I can support that. So make sure you don't use me as an excuse. This presentation grew out of a lecture I did for popular culture. As Charles indicated, I'm very much a popular culture person, and so I go to popular culture conferences annually, and I decided I wanted to do something racy because at MLA and CLA and the more staid professional organizations, you can't do the racy kinds of fun articles. And so PCA is the one time you get to do that. So I decided I'd call it Forbidden Fruits and Unholy Lusts, Illicit Sex in Black American Literature. I rewrote the introduction just this morning, just for you. So there is something to be said for the drafting and redrafting process for those of you in freshman comp. Several years ago at a Modern Language Association meeting, I heard a colleague report that Alice Walker's The Color Purple read like a how-to sex manual. The analogy somewhat surprised me, and I wondered immediately precisely how many sex manuals the prim and proper, most decorous speaker had ever perused. This was not the kind of woman that I associated with sex manuals. Anyway, I, of course, had skimmed a great many such manuals in a sort of professional interest, and looked at other pornographic and erotic text again from a professional standpoint for research purposes. And so I knew that The Color Purple in no way deserved that kind of label. So, with authority, I can say to you that contrary to popular opinion, which at one point Tony Brown, among others, was sort of pushing, that neither Alice Walker nor Gloria Naylor, nor even the best-selling Terry McMillan were the first to engage in discussing sex in black literature. They did not start it being the public presentation or disclosure of sexual promiscuity, sexual deviancy, illicit sexual activity, or socially unsanctioned sexual misconduct within black American communities. Neither Walker, nor Naylor, nor McMillan are originators of a new theme. They are simply part of a tradition, albeit one that has been masked, and one we cannot see very well, or one we choose to ignore, or one we deny in blind self-righteousness. When we examine early text in Black American literature canon, we can see that unholy lust is not that uncommon a theme, and that the idea of unsanctioned sex most often in a black, white, or master-slave context, is part and parcel of these early texts and permeates the tradition. Not only is this recurrent pattern apparent in the 19th century, it does not require a particularly erotic imagination to note the same pattern appearing both explicitly and implicitly in modern and contemporary texts. No longer veiled behind the delicate, careful, polite Victorian prose of our foremothers and forefathers, illicit sex or taboo sexual desire is out of the closet and onto the streets, or onto the printed page in all of its vivid possibilities. At any rate, that is the premise from which my paper sprang. And to be candid, it came from the query of a student who wanted to know whether the weird sex she was then reading was a theme in Black American literature. Now, those of us who teach the slave narrative regularly probably focus on Frederick Douglass and Linda Brent as the most representative texts. Typically, I think we discuss the ways in which these narratives conform to identifiable patterns in Black autobiography. That is to say, in Black autobiography, particularly if you start with the slave narrative, the slave discovers that he or she is a slave as a child. There is a quest for education, there's a quest for freedom, there is, of course, an avid description of the brutality, both physical and emotional or psychological in the narrative, and usually there's a description of the folk culture that still withstands the slave mentality. We may also talk about various authenticating strategies found in those slave narratives. And when I say authenticating strategies, I'm talking about the various ways in which the slave narrator establishes his or her credibility with the audience. Usually there'll be some kind of testimony by some reputable white person that says, I knew so-and-so, and they are indeed an escaped slave, and they've been good, and read their book, okay? Some of us even talk about the rhetorical passage or the rhetorical power of each text that we teach. We'll talk about argument and the way that the narrator couches argument. We'll talk about the use of understatement, the use of irony. So we discuss those kinds of things. Rarely do we talk about sexuality in those texts. We talk about differences in male and female slave narrative strategies, but again, I suspect that we seldom discuss the sexual erotica. To be sure, we note the origins of the birth of the mulatto class. And if you look around the room and you see the range of color complexions, and you note that most slaves came from West Africa where everybody was sort of monotone dark, you understand that the range of color complexions came about because there was some illicit mixing going on in the 19th century. And so we allude to those forced sexual liaisons between the master and the slave woman, but I doubt that many teachers or students really focus on the sexual tension in those works. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Frederick Douglass's narrative, so I allude to these works and just go on. Recall, for instance, Douglass's, I'll pause for a minute, let these folks get seated. You're going to be blind. Wherein he describes his initiation into slavery and one of those archetypal motifs where the slave narrator shares his abrupt realization of his slave status. He was a child. He had heretofore lived with his grandmother on the outskirts of the plantation. He had never witnessed a beating. What he witnessed was Captain Anthony's punishment of his Aunt Hester for the crime of being found in the company of Lloyd's Ned, a young black man. Had his master, Douglass expounded, been a man of pure morals himself, he might have been thought interested in protecting the innocence of my aunt. But those who knew him will not suspect him of any such virtue. What Douglass did not label, and what many readers do not acknowledge, is that Captain Anthony was also a sadist. He would take Aunt Hester and tie her semi-nude to a joist with her arms above her head and whip upon her naked back until she was literally covered with blood. Now you have to visualize that because the language is kind of mild. Semi-nude, that means the woman was stripped from the chest down, right? So she's there naked and only her skirt remains on her. And then he would whip upon her naked back until she was covered literally with blood. Douglass says that Anthony at times seemed to enjoy and take great pleasure in these whippings. No tears, no words, no prayers from his gory victim deterred him. Note that the following description is an almost textbook example of sadomasochism. The louder she screamed, the harder he whipped. And where the blood ran fastest, there he whipped hardest. He would whip her to make her scream and whip her to make her hush. And not until overcome by fatigue would he cease to swing the blood-clotted cowskin. Two quick observations. First, Anthony clearly enjoys his task. As his whip is curling about the naked flesh of Hester, ripping into her tender breast, as well as scoring her naked back, his fatigue or exhaustion comes as much from sexual release as it does from physical exertion. Secondly, Aunt Hester either loved pain or loved Lloyd's Ned entirely too much, for Douglas claims he often heard her heart-rending shrieks at the dawn of day. It seems a clear-cut case of the white man who wants his own black woman getting bested sexually by the black man, while the woman suffers because of their lust. And we turn to Linda Brent's Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, 1861, we find a stronger emphasis on what Brent called licentiousness, or the corruption of young slave girls by white men, on the foul wrongs endured by slave women, begetting, if you will, mulatto children by white fathers. Black girls are violated with impunity, and those who, like Brent, try desperately to hold on to the ideals of the cult of true womanhood, wherein one maintains piety, purity, virtue and chastity, submissiveness and domesticity, those women had an uphill struggle against the licentiousness and fear rampant in an atmosphere of all-pervading corruption produced by slavery. Brent approaches what she and her 19th century audience considered the indelicate topic of perverse lust with all the delicacy she could manage. Slave women had their purity violated. Rape is never mentioned. They may even be bribed or tempted with presents. Should these methods fail, the lash or starvation could follow. In any event, they mostly live in a cage of obscene birds, and their submission is compelled. Apart, however, from detailing the travails of the slave woman, Brent expends tremendous energy detailing how slavery, sexual prolificacy in slavery, dramatically affects not only the slaves, but whites as well. White wives are often embittered and emotionally crippled by jealousy, their normal humanity stripped from them by having to contend with, but not acknowledge, the bastard children of their husbands running around all over the plantation. And so Brent says, the slaveholders' sons are, of course, vitiated, even while boys, by the unclean influences everywhere around them, nor do the master's daughters always escape. She then goes on to cite how one such daughter had selected one of the meanest slaves on the plantation to father her father's first grandchild. And let me translate that prose for you. It simply means that this young white girl decided to get back at her daddy and all of her male relatives by deciding if they could go out and screw slaves, so too. She invites one into her bedroom and then produces a grandchild who is mixed blood. Okay. We're not talking about love here, but lust. Illicit sexual conduct, unlicensed and unbridled sexuality, which derives from pure power relationships and not out of any genuine human feeling. When Linda Brent, at age 15, submits to the flattering attentions of a white lover, largely because her black lover, whom she would have chosen, has been driven away by her master, who has the hots for her himself and has been pursuing her all the while, when she submits to a white lover, she does so solely because she wants to have some say about who she gives her body to. Her master, Dr. Flint, has been chasing her relentlessly. She doesn't like Dr. Flint. So she said, well, if I have to deal with somebody, at least let it be somebody that I want. The man she chooses is Mr. Sands. He is not her master, and he is not married. Dr. Flint was married. Significant virtues in a situation with few redeeming qualities. Punctuation from the backside, okay? He was also an educated gentleman, and thus even more agreeable to the pride and feelings of a slave, if her miserable situation left her any pride or sentiment. It seemed to Brent less degrading to give oneself than to submit to compulsion. There was, she felt, something akin to freedom in having a lover who has no control over you except that which he gains by kindness and attachment. Our early black novelists, borrowing liberally from slave narratives to construct their plots, depicted scenes from slave life and expounded upon themes they thought the public needed to hear, but they also made a point of indicting sexual immorality in the American South. In every version of William Wells Brown's Clotel, and there were 4 such versions, the title character is alleged at first to be the slave offspring of Thomas Jefferson. Brown treats not only the tragic mulatto as character and the indiscriminate creation of a whole new race in America, but also levels his finger at the social and moral consequences of such unrestrained lust. Beautiful quadroon and mulatto women are revered and loved by their white suitors and masters. They are given homes and delicate bowers apart from the real world, where they live in almost ideal, near marital relationship. Then, typically, the white lover marries a white woman. He is raced and he is cased, and the black lover suffers. Often these women are readmitted to slavery at the meanest levels because the jealousy of the white wife, who almost always discovers that her husband's been keeping somebody on the side, right? And so because of that, they're readmitted to slavery and have to deal with the patriarchy, et cetera, et cetera. The husband lover wants it all, his white wife and his black lover. Brown argues that he can't have it all without paying a terrible price. His marriage is destroyed by an absence of trust, and his black family is sold away before his eyes, or his mulatto children are abused daily before his eyes. And he himself, if he has any sensitivity, is consumed by guilt and by failure to act on his conscience. Interestingly, neither Douglas nor Brent showed many whites who suffered these pangs as severely as Brown's white men, nor did Brown harp on their feelings, but rather on what became of the women and the children they betrayed. Both Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, Iola Leroy, which is a wonderful sort of tear-jerking melodramatic novel of the 19th century, 1893, and Pauline Hopkins' Contending Forces, 1900, another melodramatic tear. If you like soap operas, read these two novels. They're wonderful, sort of the first black soap operas. But both of these women focus more on uplifting the race after Reconstruction, but both novels also take an obligatory swipe at unsanctioned illicit sex and the consequent immorality. Harper's protagonist, Iola, is the quintessential lovely quadroon who only discovers upon the death of her white father that she is legally a slave. Naturally, she is sold at auction by mean-spirited relatives and spends the early part of the novel fending off, as best she can, all insults to her womanhood. Iola's case strongly resembles that made for Clotel or Isabella in the Clotel saga that Brown did, where the four women have to deal with discovery of slavery. While Harper does not repeat Brown's dictum, both authors use the slave auction to illustrate how the parts of a beautiful mulatto woman were packaged. What follows is Brown's description, and note how value is determined. The bones, snooze, blood, and nerves of a young girl of 18 were sold for $500. Her moral character for $200. Her superior intellect for $100. A warranty of her devoted Christianity for $300. Her ability to make a good prayer for $200, and her chastity for $700 more. That should tell you something. That Iola is not violated with the subsequent loss of her chastity is only because the Civil War intervenes. Through the timely intercession of a slave benefactor who has himself escaped from the plantation to Union lines, Iola is rescued from the foul and odious clutches of her master to spend the rest of the war safely as a nurse for the Union Army, no longer to have to contend with people trying constantly to attack her. In Contending Forces, the plot is more ingenious or more contrived, depending on how such things are seen. A base white man covets his neighbor's wife. It doesn't help that the neighbor has only recently arrived from the West Indies with plans to free his slaves. The villainous neighbor, Anson Pollock, decides that the wife has too much color to her cheek and her hair is a trifle too curly, hence the telltale taint of black blood. And y'all know people be looking at the hairlines and at the nose to see if somebody is passing or not. He schemes to have the new neighbor killed and to make himself the master of his neighbor's wife. He succeeds with his nefarious scheme up to a point. The husband dies, but the wife kills herself before she can be ravaged. Their children, however, are sold away, and there the rest of the plot follows them. Of consequence to my argument is that the colored descendants of both the villain and the good neighbor meet years later, and doggone if we don't find that villainy is inherited in the genes. The bastard black child of Pollock's loins plans to marry the sister of his best friend while also attempting to seduce or make his mistress by blackmail her best friend. His bad white blood drives him to entertain these ideals of illicit sexual relationships. Ultimately, he pays for his perfidy with his life, something that never happened in the narratives to the white suitors of black women. Contemporary historical novels that look at slavery and Reconstruction do so with all the verve available to the modern novelist. Themes and plot lines implicitly suggested or delicately alluded to in the earlier text are treated with forthright dispatch today. Shirley Ann Williams' Desarose, 1986, for instance, explicitly describes in one segment the forbidden liaisons between slave men and white women. When asked what he did as a slave, Nathan says succinctly, "Love pretty women's like you, Miss Rophel, the lonely white reluctant benefactor who has given sanctuary to escaped slaves." Just before he confidently makes love to her, and the love scene is indeed described vividly, he describes his initiation into various forms of sex by Miss Lorraine, a single older white woman with a wild nature who took her belly warmers from the lowest of the low. Described as freakish, Miss Lorraine trained her young slave lovers, teaching them about the joys of oral copulation and the terrors of making love, with death ever close at hand to a white woman, truly forbidden fruit. If a sex partner ever initiated sexual activity, if Miss Lorraine ever lost the feel of control, the slave could be sold, or worse, Miss Lorraine, who swore each lover to silence, could scream rape. I have to understand Miss Lorraine's position. She's a woman who has a strong sexual nature, and she's been repressed herself. She's a white woman, she can't express any kind of sexuality, unlike a Madonna, say. Octavia Butler's Kindred, wherein science fiction meets black history, proceeds from the premise of a modern woman from 1975 pulled back and forth across time and space to emerge periodically in 1830s Maryland and the origins of her family line. Let me pause here and say that Dana Franklin is the protagonist. She's a Californian, she's a writer, she's married to a white man, and they live in Los Angeles. And periodically, she is pulled back mysteriously to 1830s Maryland. So Dana Franklin and Alice, her great forebears, several times removed, are the proverbial flip sides of the same coin. Dana must help mother, nurture, and teach young Rufus Wayland, the white child later destined to become the male progenitor of her family tree because of his forced attentions to Alice. This relationship is another one of those black man, black woman triangles. Alice has a black lover. Young Rufus Wayland does not like the fact that the black lover is beating his time with the black woman, so he gets a little revenge on that. Jean Toomer, a Harlem Renaissance artist, does much the same thing in playing with that kind of triangle in the story Louisa in Cain from 1923. In any event, when Alice dies, Rufus, intellectually attracted to Dana, now expects from Dana not only intellectual stimulation, but the same sexual intimacy he demanded and coerced from Alice. And this from a woman who had been his surrogate mother. Talk about your Oedipal complexes and perverted urges. Rufus did hate his father, and he tried like hell to seduce Dana. Toni Morrison's Beloved in 1987 gives us insight into what destroyed the relationship between Setha and Hall, her slave husband. It seems that shortly before the family and some selected others made their escape attempt, Setha is attacked, and Hall must watch from a hiding place as he observes the sexual humiliation and degradation of his wife as two young white men attack her and then forcibly suck at her breast, stealing her milk, while their uncle, the school teacher, merely observes. They're treating her like she was some kind of animal or cow. And before Beloved, there was Charlie Breedlove's tender, drunken rage of his daughter, Piccola, in The Bluest Eye. And also, I think, in The Bluest Eye, or is it, yeah, it's The Bluest Eye, I think. There's another sort of story about incest or child molestation. I had thought to spend some time on black autobiography as another genre where illicit sex is illustrated. Suffice it to say that Langston Hughes is the big C while virtually ignoring his own sexuality and sexual experiences. In a quick sketch, paints the plight of two young African prostitutes who become victims of a gangbang. For all of their labor, they are never paid, just used. And then there's Maya Angelou's Caged Bird. I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. Here you recall Maya remained silent for 4 years following her rape at age 8 by the boyfriend of her mother. Later, as a teenager, she thinks she must be some kind of abnormal sexual freak, and so goes out of her way to solicit a sexual relationship with a young man just to prove to herself that there's nothing wrong with her. She thinks she might be a gay woman or a homosexual or something like that. Returning to fiction, I could also talk about James Baldwin and the sexual tension that animates his works. As a teenager, as a babysitter actually, I was reading Another Country solely for what was called the titillation factor. Actually, the book had been banned by the school system, and of course, anytime a book gets banned, it automatically piques interest, and so there I was, babysitting on one hand and reading the book, turning the pages with the other. The violent story of Rufus and Leona was both compelling and vivid, and few readers missed the suggestion of homosexual erotica that connects young John Grimes to Elijah of Go Tell It on the Mountain. And I have another note that says, and incest is a theme in Just Above My Head. Anytime people teach James Baldwin, you have to deal with themes of implicit sexuality. They're always just there, sort of nudging at the corners of the text. There is, of course, more than a suggestion of dangerous sexual energy in Wright's Native Son. How many of you have read Native Son? All to the good. The rest of you need to, okay? You remember, those of you who have read it, that Bigger murders Mary Dalton purely out of fear from being caught, quite literally, with forbidden fruit in his hands. He has been holding a drunken Mary in his arms and has become excited by the feel of her lips against his, the scent of her hair and skin, and finally the feel of her breast in his hands. You know, Mary is drunk, she thinks she's being carried by a boyfriend, there's a little nuzzling going on, and Bigger kind of likes it, feels good to him, you know. And then what Wright calls the hysterical terror sets in when blind Mrs. Dalton enters the room, and we all know what happens next. Bigger kills Bessie, his black lover, shortly after he rapes her. And you can argue that they're making love, but Bessie has not consented to this love making at all. She said, no, Bigger, no, I don't want to, you know, leave me alone. And so that's not making love, that's rape. Date rape, we might even say. Here again, we're told that fear drives Bigger, but there is an ironic juxtaposition between the little death that occurs in a sexual copulation and the big one of Bessie's murder. And if you look at Chester Himes, if he hollers, let him go, there's another black man, white woman, black woman kind of thing. Richard Wright's 8 Men is a collection of short stories, and usually one does not teach Wright with an idea with humor in mind, but there are 2 stories, one which is fairly straightforward and the other which is fairly humorous. But those 2 stories contain more than an element of sexual tension, and those elements become dominant in the stories. The Man Who Killed the Shadow focuses on 2 rather insignificant characters, a black male, married, and a single 40-year-old white librarian. In the larger scheme of things, neither is an important character in their respective worlds, and both are deemed shadows. The white woman is a stereotype personified, a sexless nonentity, a white shadow. It's kind of a black mark, if you pardon the pun, against librarians, to assume they're all sterile and sexless. She does, however, apparently see Wright's male protagonist as a way of ending her virginity. After all, black men are supposed to want white women, right? His palpable fear of her sexual overtures, coded as they are by race and caste, drives him to protect himself by preventing any further intimation of sexual energy from her. In other words, she wants him, he doesn't want her, but she's setting the situation up, he doesn't like it, so he kills her, okay? And ironically, she dies unfulfilled. That is, she remains a virgin. The second story, Man of All Work, is by contrast almost funny, although as usual, Wright's is a grim humor. In this tale, an unemployed black husband puts on his sick wife's clothes to find money, to find work as a maid to earn money. The man's been unemployed, much like today's economy, he can't find a job, and he's desperate. He desperately wants to find some kind of work, and he says, well, I've been a cook in the Navy, I can do this, and so he puts on his wife's clothes and goes out to find some work. What he discovers, and of course his wife has been saying, don't put on my clothes, don't do this, and he does it on the sly when she's asleep. What he discovers is the kind of sexual harassment encountered by many black domestic workers laboring in white houses. The white wife knows that her husband has this unseeming lust or this thing for the black, calls her new maid into the bathroom to bathe her back while she discusses her husband's faults, warning the maid to beware. And now you have to imagine this scene. Here's this man in his woman's clothing being called into the bathroom to bathe the employer's wife, right? And the sexual energy unleashed but stifled in a man in woman's clothing is incredible. The poor guy's just suffering. And then, as usual, as can be expected, the husband does make the obligatory pass just as his wife returns. The wife gets her gun and resolves to shoot, not the husband, but the maid. And of course, she actually winds up hitting our disguised hero. At this point, neither the husband nor the wife is as yet aware of the gender switch. And I won't go on and tell you the rest. Go read it for yourselves. The last of the big three, and usually when you talk about African American literature, for one while there were three major authors that everybody did: James Baldwin, Richard Wright, and Ralph Ellison. So this is the last of the big three. In Invisible Man, Ellison goes beyond the suggestion of sexual tension to a consummation of perverted, unsanctioned sex. Consider the True Blood Norton episode. Now, pause again. How many of you have read Invisible Man? The teachers in the hand raised their room. The rest of you have not. Okay. 1, 2, 3. My mother over here has raised. Okay. And so, all right. So I stand corrected. But for the benefit of the majority who have not read Invisible Man, there is a scene people refer to as the True Blood episode, in which this black peasant, James Trueblood, relates this dream he had. And in this dream, he has mounted, if you will, both his daughter, while his wife, the three of them slept in the same bed out of poverty. The three of them sleep in the same bed. He has a dream, and in the dream, witches are riding him, and he's fighting them off, and he mounts his daughter instead of his wife, which of course leads to the problem. The father, during the dream, commits incest upon his daughter, raping her while the wife sleeps on the other side of the bed. This was the weird sex that my student had talked about earlier. Central to the tale is Norton, who is the white philanthropist, his response to the story, one which the white villagers repeatedly encouraged Jim Trueblood to tell. It seems that Norton has desires on his own fair yet unattainable daughter, and he must settle for the vicarious sexual satisfaction of hearing how Trueblood actually did it. And it's a clear-cut case of unholy lust. Norton has desires on his own daughter. He can't get to her, so he settles for hearing how Trueblood does it. I'm trying to bring this to a close so we can have time for discussion. But as you can tell, I've still not gotten to the contemporary women writers who stand accused of putting all the dirty linen in the public's eye. Nor have I talked about Ishmael Reed, his Minnie the Moocher from Louisiana Red, or the peculiar kind of Edgar Allan Poe sex that occurs in Flight to Canada. Are any of you Edgar Allan Poe fans? Good. You read the Fall of the House of Usher? All right. You remember that Roderick has the hots for his sister? In that one, well, in Flight to Canada, there's a kind of parody of Edgar Allan Poe, and the sister comes out of the grave to get to the guy who's the white protagonist in that story, and it's really, really funny. Sick, but funny. I haven't mentioned the tangled sexual relationships found in some of Ernest Gaines' fiction, like Of Love and Dust. And if you haven't read Ernest Gaines, you need to, because after all, he's a Louisiana writer and writes out of what he calls a Louisiana thing. I've mentioned Toni Morrison, but I've not been able to discuss Ntozake Shange, or Gail Jones, or Anne Ellen Shockley, or Gloria Naylor, or Alice Walker, or Terry McMillan. I will say that Shange caught a whole hell of a lot of flack from colored girls who considered Suicide When the Rainbow Was Enough for the sort of dirty linen in public argument. That is, people did not want to know that people were having all kinds of sexual fantasies and were getting upset when other people left out of their bathrooms and whatnot. It's a wonderful play, and when people calm down and get over the sort of Tony Brown mentality that criticizes the work before even looking at it closely, you begin to see a lot of things that Shange has going for her in that story. Anybody looking for heavily accented sexuality to undergird a tale, perverted, normal, abnormal, licensed, or unlicensed sexuality has only to look at Colored Girls or Shockley's Say Jesus and Come to Me, which incidentally is about lesbian love affair. And instead of the preacher being the sort of male person who seduces all the young women, the preacher is a woman who has these attractions for women in the congregation and they for her, and how they consummate these things is very interesting reading. Then there's also Gail Jones's Corregidora and Eva's Man, wherein in Eva's Man in particular, you have, how shall we say it, a woman's violent reaction to the sense of being a sexual object. Violence to the point where a brother loses something very important and valuable to him and has it placed in his mouth as a kind of trophy. I'll let you figure that one out. And if you read virtually anything by Terry McMillan, the bestseller, right? I will not teach Terry McMillan in the classroom because I think beyond the titillating scenes, there's nothing there. Ultimately, it's all titillation. And there's nothing else that she says. I guess I have to go back to saying I don't think that The Color Purple is as instructive as a how-to sex manual, even though Celie is given some instructions on how her body functions and what the various and sundry little buttons are for. I don't think The Color Purple is the first time Alice Walker ever flirted with the idea of incest and child abuse in Black life. I would encourage you to read The Child Who Favored Daughter in the collection In Love and Trouble, Stories of Black Women. This is a truly complex tale, seldom discussed because of the pain that radiates from its core, a pain that makes us all want to bury ourselves deeply and suppress this particular story for what we do when we explicate it. What do we do when we explicate in the face of such intense pain and sorrow? How do we as teachers surmount the horror to teach this tale as mere fiction? Race and caste are mixed together with the twin taboos of brother-sister, father-daughter, incestuous urges, and a very ugly kind of family violence. The child who favors daughter, the father-sister, is doomed in this tale because of a twisted, obsessive love. The nameless father attacks his only daughter for giving her love to another. And it's not just that she gives her love to another, it's that she gives it to a white other. He also attacks her because, having beaten her and subsequently seen her half naked, he is consumed by unnameable desire, and to save himself, he attacks his child, cuts off her bare breast from her chest, and casts what he finds in his hands to the dogs. As I said, it's a very painful kind of story, but if we're talking about illicit sex and unperverted urges, perhaps because the sexual violence in our contemporary tales, especially those told by Black women novelists, is particularly graphic, we think of these writers as being the beginning of the exploration of some new theme. But I think we're also dealing with an unapologetic foregrounding of a contemporary madness. As I've tried to show, we're not dealing with a new phenomenon. The specter of unholy lust, of illicit sex, unsanctioned and unlicensed sexuality permeates our history, whether we acknowledge it or not, and thus recurs throughout our literature as a necessary revelation. And I think it occurs in all kinds of genres as well. Samuel Chip Delaney is a science fiction writer. I don't know how many of you are into science fiction, but he's one of the foremost Black science fiction. He's one of the foremost science fiction writers, and he happens to be a Black author. He has this one novel called The Tides of Lust, which you cannot find anywhere. It is a collector's item, and it is largely pornographic. And in his, let's see, there's another novel, it's a very long novel, like this title escapes me at the moment, but sexuality occurs over and over again, and that's one of those sort of futuristic novels where gang rapes are a kind of regular thing in the future. And then he has his autobiography, The Motion of Light and Water. And even in The Motion of Light and Water, Delaney is exceedingly revealing. He talks about sort of being acey-deucey, swinging both ways, and describes rather vividly his sexual encounters with both sexes and the kind of menage a trois that occurs in some of those kinds of relationships. Anyway, writers working with eroticism, perverted or not, have often used it to arrive at some psychological penetration of an individual, cultural, or social problem. Like death, taxes, and the IRS, sex will always be with us. Our writers show us the various ways we have been affected by it. Thank you.